To say it's an exciting time to be working at Circus World Museum. In addition to, as Tom was mentioning, the acquisition of the Al Ringling Theater, which is obviously very huge for us. There's a couple other things that are going to be happening. One that's actually happening right now. If you drive down by the museum, you'll see the old concrete tent awning that spans between the camel shops and the ring barn is being taken down. And that had been up since the 1970s and was really in a very dilapidated shape, but we're replacing that with a reconstruction of the wooden fence that once lined Water Street. We have a lot of photo documentation of that fence, and it's a part of the broader project, longer project to kind of restore the look of old Ringlingville. Along with that, later this spring and by early summer, you'll see us doing some restoration work on the old office building. And we had received a federal grant to restore that several years ago. And after many committees and plans, that's actually now going to be undertaking its restoration project. So a lot of historical work going on at Circus World. And the office is actually, I think it kind of maybe an interesting way for me to start this talk. It's the most unassuming building you see in Ringlingville, and a lot went on in that building. That's where the plans for all the circus took place in the winter months. But along with that, another significant yet I think underappreciated site of the Ringling Winter Quarters is the talk that we're going to have here just now, and that is the history of the car shops, or really the railroad facilities of the Ringling Winter Quarters. I mean, it was out of the office that I say that everything was planned and put into motion, but it was from this building and these facilities that the circus went and reached out to the broader world. And today, when people think of the Ringlings and they think of Baraboo, they think of Water Street. They think of all those wonderful animal barns, but there was a lot more to the Ringlings winter quarter operations. There was, for example, a farm just a few blocks to the west where Flambeau Plastics is now. And there they quartered their baggage horses, many of the baggage, there was 5 barns there. There were crewmen that worked up there. That's where they also housed many of their wagons during the winter, and they raised forage and crops for their animals. Again, very few people know about that operation. And right next to it was the car shops. And so the Ringlings had a network of facilities around Baraboo. But like I say, we're going to talk about one of them today. I think an underappreciated aspect of the railroad, of the other operations today. And that is, of course, their railroad car shops. So to start with, though, let's start very briefly just by talking about the beginning of the Ringling show. So the Ringlings get started in 1884. 5 brothers band together and they decide that they're not going to follow their father into his business of making horse harnesses. They're going to go into that exciting business of the circus. And in the early 1880s, the circus was at its peak. This was the golden age of the American circus. There were hundreds and hundreds of circuses on the road at this time. And many, many very big, very successful shows. And they were all traveling through the upper Midwest and Wisconsin. And so the Ringlings were moving into an established entertainment business with some heavy hitters already well established. They didn't start out very big. They started off as a very small show and a show that had a rough start. The first 4 years was very touch and go. They were not a railroad-based show. They were a wagon-based show. And we're very fortunate to have one wagon within our collection. This actually is a wagon that you could see in our Feld exhibit hall today. This was a wagon that was used by the Parsons brothers, and they sold concessions for the Ringlings. But this really is a good example of how the Ringlings moved from town to town, overland by horse-drawn vehicles, over muddy roads that were very susceptible to the weather. And as a result, for the first couple of years, it was not guaranteed that their show was going to be a success. But the brothers did have a very good business model. They were a very tight working organization. They may have fought amongst each other, but once they made a decision, there was the unified front. They put all of their proceeds back into the development of the business. And by 1889, really 5 years, they had built it up to a successful show where if they were going to grow anymore, they had grown as big as they were going to get as a horse-based circus or a wagon-based circus, and they needed to transfer their show to the railroad. Circuses had been traveling the country by rails since the 1850s, but as you all know, I'm talking to probably some of the most knowledgeable people on the history of the railroads in the United States. But in the 1850s and 1860s, the rail networks weren't as extensive yet. The equipment was not quite as efficient. And so circuses were dabbling with it. But the great railroad-based circuses didn't come around until about 1872, when P.T. Barnum partnered with two Wisconsin showmen to form out his circus for that year. P.T. Barnum's great Roman Hippodrome and Menagerie, and there's all sorts of other flowers onto that title. But it was that show, that Barnum show in 1872 was a smashing success. The rail networks had really developed by that point. It was kind of everything had come together, so to speak, and they made something like $400,000 or $500,000 in that performance season, which was monumentally huge for 1872. So by the time the Ringlings get their start in 1884, railroad circuses had already been well established. It was the way to go to develop and grow your business. And by the end of the 1889 season, the brothers were ready to take that step. And so in that year, they end up, let me grab my glasses here. I guess I can read from the screen here. I have both bifocals and readers. I have 3 sets of glasses. And so I sometimes have to, figure out which one do I need to look through in order to see what I'm reading at. So in 1889, Otto Ringling reaches out to one of those big circuses, the Adam Forepaugh Sells Brothers Circus, and inquiring about buying their used railroad equipment. This is in the summer of '89, and they're successful. They buy as you can see my list up here, a couple of stock cars, a box car, baggage car, 3 flat cars. They also reach out to the Burr Robbins Circus, which was out of Janesville, Wisconsin, and buy 3 or 5 railroad cars from them. That is the beginning of their railroad fleet. And in 1890, they take their circus on the rails. And from that point, things just really take off for the Ringlings. Their business model combined with now being a railroad show, they can reach out across the country. Their circus really starts to take off. And the photos that we have here show where their circus goes from a railroad perspective. These are images of their railroad fleet as it would have appeared at the turn of the century, so about 10 years after they made this switch. But it had really developed into a significant operation. And as I mentioned, we'll see here in the bottom, by 1910, the fleet had grown. Like I say, you have these very simple origins in 1889. By 1910, they have over 16 Pullman, 2 private cars, over 60 flat cars, additional coaches. Their total valuation of their railroad equipment from the insurance records go up to $487,000. And that includes fancy cars like the advertisement car, that car right here, that's an advertisement car. They have 4 of those. That's the car that travels 3 weeks in advance of the circus. And the team that lives out of that car secures the showgrounds lot, the food for the show that's going to be fed to the crew. They take care of all of the advertising, the distribution of the posters, the heralds, the newspaper advertisements. They have 4 of those now, crisscrossing the country. Well, the thing is, all of these cars and this fleet of railroad cars has to be taken care of somewhere. And so in 1889, as they are acquiring their initial group of fleet of railroad cars, they're also securing property here in Baraboo to store them. And their first car area, and they don't even have a car shops right away, their first area to store their railroad cars is not too far from where Lake Statens building is today. So if you take Lynn Street all the way down to the west, where it kind of curves off to the right, and becomes, I think, is it Potter, I believe it is. At the very end, where before it kind of turns off to the left, you're going to see these white kind of oil towers there. That is where the Ringlings' first rail yard was. They leased property from a Mrs. Potter. And they increasingly kept adding and leasing more and more land from her and adding more and more tracks. But they at least had a place to store their railroad cars. It was also where they started to work on their railroad cars as well. And they worked out there, they repainted them and refurbished them out in the open air, really as the weather would allow. And as we all know, Wisconsin fall, winter, and spring can not necessarily be the most forgiving environment, but they worked out in those conditions. Early on, though, they did make use of being neighbors to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad yards. This lovely image that we have here, of course, of the roundhouse, the Ringling yards would have just been off of here. Lake States is right about there. The library is somewhere in that vicinity. So this is in the backyard of your guys' home base. And early on, they've developed a working relationship with the management at the C&W. We have documents that show that they hired out the C&W. The C&W did repair work for their cars for a fee. They also leased space in that roundhouse, that fancy advertisement car. There's a newspaper account of one of those cars being painted up in the winter of 1891 in space in that roundhouse being leased to the Ringling Brothers. Now, the brothers also sent out work to be done. They were not shy about using other resources around the country. And there's an account of railroad cars being sent down to Chicago to have specialized brake work done. So their cars may be stored outside. They were working on them outside. But they were using the resources available to them. But this is where their railroad facilities get a start. By 1892, they've decided that they're going to invest in their own railroad building, and they construct a building 190 by 20 feet right next to the roundhouse. Unfortunately, we don't have a real good photo of that building. This image down here is the only image that we know of that possibly shows that building. That is of the working crew on the inside of that building. We think this is that building because those windows there, though that lighted windows there, does not appear in any way in the current car shops building, historically or otherwise. But by 1892, they have this building, and so they can do work inside as well as outside. Throughout this period, they're still working with the C&W. They always seem to maintain a good working relationship with them. This building, though, did not entirely go through its history without its share of problems. There was at least 2 fires in that building. In one case, the building was sufficiently damaged. They had to do significant repair work, but in each case, the rolling stock did not get damaged, and there was no loss of life from their crew that were working there. That building stands until 1910, when just after the new car shops was built, it's torn down, and its lumber and building materials were used at that farm that I mentioned. That's where Flammable Plastics is today. One thing that I've discovered in looking at the Ringlings and their winter quarters overall is they believed in recycling. They never threw anything away. And when they tore down one building, they'd use that to build another. And so certainly that is the case of the original car shops. Nothing survives of it today. The barns that were all there are long gone, but they did repurpose those for use later on. So before we get into the history of the car shops that stand today, there is one other aspect of the railroad operations that I think needs to be talked about. And again, this is something else that happened not too far away from the Lake States headquarters, and that is where the trains were loaded. And you can see this site today. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with the Baraboo Depot, the C&W Depot that still stands. Well, here is the awning for the loading platform. This is the depot. This is Lynn Street. And so some of these buildings are still there today. Part of the Rulin Brewery that is on the first floor, the first floor of that building still stands. Lake States is just behind here. The library, that's the Effinger Brewery. That's the library for my library is just down there. So the winter quarters is somewhere in the background there. And so the loading site, actually, and this is where it looks like today. This is Vine Street. This is Lynn Street. The city hall is just behind those trees there. And that space between Vine Street and the railroad overpass bridge, that's where the Ringlings loaded their train for most of it. And I'll mention the other secondary site here in a second. And we have lots of photo documentation for this. And actually, one of these images actually came through the generosity of one of you gentlemen here, Paul Young. Let us copy, a gentleman sitting not too far from you here, lent us a photo album that he has. And this is one of the images from that photo album. Some lovely images of loading in that area. But a couple of interesting things about this, and this is where the parts of the fun job of what I do for an existence is, as archivist, I get to study these images. When they were loading, they were pulling equipment not only from the winter quarters on Water Street, but also they were pulling wagons and horses from their farm where Flambeau Plastics is. And so you have horses coming and going in all directions. And this image here, these are horses coming from the Ringling farm. And for the longest time, I couldn't figure out where the heck is this photo taking place. And some of the landmarks were clear to me. That building is the Hereford Canning Company. That is where St. Vincent de Paul is now today. That railroad embankment still exists, but this was before there was a bridge at Broadway. So the Broadway downtown stopped at the river. That bridge was not built until the 1920s. There was not a cross connection to South Boulevard, and the railway underpass is right about there. So it's just an interesting example of how the landscape of Baraboo changes. And when they brought the horses up to load the railroad cars, they would bring them down Lynn Street. The Lynn Street continues out to the east. And I believe it's Quarry Street on the other side of South that comes up. And when you look at some of these other photos, the horses are coming up right there. And if you look, these horses here are coming up right to that road there. And so the horses would come up and they would help load the wagons and then off they would go. This was a real popular activity in the spring for people to come out and watch. Crowds of people from Baraboo would come out and watch the loading of the train, and it would happen in sections. They would load up sections and send out sections. Excuse me, and there was always something to watch. I mean, actually, when the circus was on the road and the train would come to town, people came out just to watch the train arrive and for the train to be unloaded. So this was a popular activity to watch, but there was also the chance of some excitement to occur. The newspaper accounts are full of animals not always being very cooperative. For example, one year the zebras really did not want to be loaded, and the ensuing mayhem was of great entertainment to the local crowds. Likewise, the elephants could prove to be difficult. And the elephants, at least in this image, we have some visual evidence that they were not loaded down by the railway depot. That is actually probably really close to where Lake State's building stands now today. That building was part of the C&W yards. I think that was maybe the baggage depot, I believe it was. But this image is most likely near where the library is and where your guys' building is. And so the elephants were loaded in a slightly different area. But one year, there was an elephant that really did not want to go on the road and broke away and ran down to the Baraboo River, and they had to be coaxed back to the train. And so, again, there's always a lot of excitement at any aspect of Ringlingville, the winter quarters, but loading the trains was no exception. Also, just one last thing about the loading before I move on to the next slide. Is that there's when you do research, it's always incomplete, right? It's always an ongoing project, but you also always find tantalizing clues of something that you know is out there, but you may never find. In my research for this, I found a newspaper account of filming of the loading of the Ringling train in 1912. There was two guys who ran one of the local theaters here in town on 3rd Street, and there's an advertisement where they were showing their film of the loading of the Ringling train in a theater in Prairie du Sac. And I've not found any evidence that that film unfortunately survives, but I would love to see any footage of Baraboo in before World War I, let alone Ringling-related film from 1912. And so we know it exists. Maybe someday in some archive somewhere it'll turn up. But it's just one of those things that's both fascinating and frustrating all at the same time. But that did indeed occur. So the Ringlings throughout the 1890s and at the turn of the century keep growing and developing their business. They in no time become one of the biggest and most successful circuses in the United States, which is no small feat when you consider the competition that they're facing. Their greatest success, though, probably can be marked by a business deal that they acquired that they did in 1907. They acquired the Barnum and Bailey Circus. P.T. Barnum had died years before. His surviving partner, James A. Bailey, dies in 1906. And in 1907, the brothers buy the show from Bailey's widow. And with that, not only do they acquire the Barnum and Bailey circus itself and all of its equipment and its winter quarters in Bridgeport, Connecticut, they also acquire another circus that was a part of the Barnum and Bailey property. The Barnum and Bailey show had acquired the Adam Forepaugh Sells Brothers Circus, that show that the Ringlings first bought their initial railroad cars from. Well, that had been bought up by the Barnum show, and the Ringlings acquired that when they acquired the P.T. Barnum show. Now, they keep the Barnum and Bailey Circus operating as a separate entity for a number of years. They maintained the Bridgeport winter quarters as a separate entity, and the brothers would trade off what year who's going to run the Ringling show, what year is going to who's going to run the Barnum show. But the Adam Forepaugh show, they retire temporarily, and they bring all of that rolling stock to Baraboo. And so 27 railroad cars are brought to Baraboo for storage and eventual probably inclusion into their own. They decide which cars they want to use for their own railroad fleet, but they're still using that property next to the railroad, to the C&W shops, and so which is already bursting at the seams from their own railroad fleet. Now they're adding a second circus train to be stored and take care of there as well. And so it becomes very obvious they need a new facility to care for and to store their now rather massive collection of railroad cars. And in 1909, they acquire property and they start construction on just such a facility, and that is the car shops that still stand today. It's built on what was known then as the flats of the Baraboo River. So that area where St. Vinny's is and the car shops is, that was a nice flat level ground right adjacent to the Baraboo River. And the first part of that facility is finished by 1909. So when the show comes off the road, they have a large yard, large enough to hold 2 trains. In fact, the newspaper accounts are specific about that. They wanted a rail yard large enough to hold 2 trains. And they also had a building that was big enough to house 3 railroad cars during the winter for work. So not as big as the structure that exists now. And I don't know if it's really visible, but this is the Sanborn fire insurance map from 1913, and there is a wall divide right about there that you can see. Now, I don't know if that marks so that the eastern section of that building, would that be the first section built and they simply added to the west? That I don't know, but they built the first part of the building was built basically temporarily. They knew as they were building it, they were going to need to expand this building, and so the newspaper accounts talk about in the winter of 1909. No sooner does the first part of this building is constructed that there are plans underway to expand that building next year. And in 1910, the rest of the structure is added on. That can house 9 railroad cars. They can work on 9 cars at a time during the winter months. And so by 1913, this is what the building looks like. These are all images of the car shops. This is one 1913 from the Billboard magazine, brand spanking new. The other images are as well, pretty much contemporaries between 1913 and probably 1915. Of the car shops, and you can actually see this one's a little bit hard to see, but that's the top of the car shops there. This is their railroad facility until the Ringlings leave. It is quite an operation that they do have there. At one time, at least, on average, I should say, that about 37 men worked out of the shops. They were divided into two departments, the car shops department and the car repairs department. And I'm not entirely clear yet as to what differentiated the two. We do know that there were two distinct departments, and we do have at the Parkinson Library some business records relative to the winter quarters operations, including employee records. And we have employee records from 1911 to 1918. And they do mark the different departments of the winter quarters: the baggage horse department, the wardrobe department, the office had its own department. And so there's clear listings of the different departments of the winter quarters. And there is a clear separate listing for the car shops and a clear separate listing for the car repairs, as also opposed to the shops department, which is where there's that long brick building right across from our museum, the Baraboo Arts Building. That was an original winter quarters building. That's where the wagons were repaired. There's employees for that. And so there's clear delineation for two separate staff that are operating out of here. My guess is that one was in charge of both moving and around the cars, perhaps painting the cars, but the car repairs may have been the guys who were working on the brakes, the actual specific equipment. I honestly don't know. That's guesswork on my part. But there were two departments there. The crew worked 60 hours a week, 6 days a week. Their average pay was $3.50 a week, about just over 17 cents per hour. And that was not too different from the other departments. They would pay more. If you were specialized skills, they would pay you more, and that was the case here at the car shops as well as other departments. But it was a sizable portion of the overall winter quarters operations. Now, one question I had developed myself over as doing this was that, so they had this building, they had the trackage out there. How did they move the cars around? Did they have their own switch engine? I think that would be kind of cool if they did. To the best of my knowledge, they did not have their own switch engine. We have a number of circumstantial evidence that states that they used their own draft horses to pull their cars around the shops. And actually, that area is pretty level. So it probably wasn't that difficult to do. And if you're moving single cars or two cars at a time, we do have the reminiscences of Francis D. Sawtelle, who was a local historian in the early to mid years of the 20th century, remembering teams of horses. There was also a newspaper account of a fire at the Hereford Canning Company, and I'll show you where that was in the next slide. That was a big canning company right next to the car shops, and there was a huge blaze there in 1915. The light could be seen for miles outside of Baraboo, and there's a real concern that fire would spread to the rail cars and to the shops. And in the case of emergency, they didn't fire up an engine to move the cars. They brought teams of horses from the farm to move the cars around. There were switch engines occasionally used, and again, this relationship with the C&W is still continuing up to the very end. They were apparently renting engines from the C&W to pull their cars, either to park them, to bring them down to the shops in the fall, but certainly to bring them up for the loading in the spring. Because we have this account that one of the switch engines got mired on the track down at the car shops. And if you look at the topography of that land, they needed an engine because there's that main railroad line, but then that spur that runs down to the shops has to go down a sufficient grade. And so pulling multiple cars up that grade by horsepower was probably too difficult. So they had to have a locomotive to do it. But throughout, I've seen accounts over the years that its location on the flats, that ground was soft. And so in this case, apparently what happened was the weight of the engine forced the rails to split, and that's how she got stuck on the track. And so, which also may lead to why they didn't have a heavy locomotive working down on the shops. So no switch engines unless it was specifically probably for loading and getting ready to go out on the road in the spring. So much of the history of the car shops, though, actually takes place after the Ringlings are gone. The Ringlings leave Baraboo in 1918. They go out for the 1918 season, but during that year, the surviving brothers decide to consolidate the Barnum and Bailey show and the Ringling show. There's a lot of reasons for it. Some speculate that's because John Ringling, one of the surviving brothers, didn't like Baraboo. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not. He didn't really care for it, but and convinced his brother to make the decision. There was also another possible factor that restrictions on railroad travel for private enterprises during the war, during the World War I, were becoming more and more constricted. And so the use of railroad engines for something besides the war effort was becoming more restricted. And it was really difficult for the Ringlings to maintain several trains for several circuses. And so it was, amongst those decisions, they decided to combine the shows. And when the show went off the road into winter quarters in the fall of 1918, they didn't come back to Baraboo. They go to Bridgeport. And the winter quarters at Bridgeport is different than Baraboo. Whereas Baraboo, the sites are spread throughout town. In Bridgeport, pretty much everything is consolidated also into one site. But ultimately, that's the beginning of the end of the circus here in Baraboo. The Ringlings retain most of the property well into the 1920s. They lease it out to different local businesses, and that's what happens here at the car shops. They do leave equipment here. They don't take every single train with them. And this is typical with the rest of the winter quarters as well. Those buildings are full of documents and wagons and wardrobes, stuff they didn't need for the next year of the show. And it kind of becomes a place that's where they mothball their old stuff. And there's some circumstantial accounts. This one here by Francis D. Sawtelle, again, the Chappie Fox, talking about a single railroad car that was left there by the Ringlings. Fred Dollinger, my predecessor, kind of the great circus historian, was telling me recently that he had run across an account where multiple train cars had been left by the Ringlings after they had left. I've seen also a newspaper account where those railroad cars were being cleared away because in 1920, Charles Ringling was looking at perhaps a Racine-based radiator manufacturing company was going to use the building as their production facility. So they had to clear out all the old equipment. That business operation didn't really, it kind of fell through, but the Ringlings found other people to lease the shops. Hereford Canning Company, which is this facility right here. This is all that Hereford Canning. So that big fire that occurred, you can see how close they are to the shops. St. Vincent de Paul is right there now. But that was the facility that caught fire. They used part of the shops as storage for their own vehicles. A tobacco company also rents the shops to basically to process their product. That is what kind of carries this building in the early 20s. By 1926, though, the Ringlings land a deal where they first lease and then eventually sell the building to the to the Northwestern Refrigeration Company, a company that was going to use it to both build and repair railroad refrigerator cars. And they own the building for a number of decades afterwards. And it's the Northwestern Refrigeration Company that starts to add all of these other buildings to the site. By 1940, they have expanded even more. And this is the main expansion. When we see the building in its current configuration, it really takes shape by 1940. We're fortunate to have at the museum the plans for the expansion. So the original Ringling car shops is to the west. Everything from here to the east is the addition that the company put on in 1940. They also built other outbuildings. The original library, actually, to the circus world, interestingly, gets started there. So this little building right there, little white building that still stands, was where my department first got its origins in the mid 1960s. Little side note that's not relevant to our presentation, but I thought I'd add it just because it's kind of cool. Anyway, so the refrigeration company adds to the property. This is a real nice aerial view that we have down there that show the extent of the property. And again, most of the buildings that are there today were there by 1940. You can see how long that structure is. But that's the way things stand until the early 1960s. The refrigeration car company essentially phases out of business, and in 1964, Circus World acquires it. Our museum opened up to the public in 1959 after a 10-year effort to build and develop the museum. And our first director, Chappie Fox, had secured we had already a couple of wagons in our possession at the time of founding the museum. But in 1962, we secured a deal. Chappie secured a deal where we acquired around 11 rollable wagons from Walt Disney, some of our more prominent wagons. Disney was a big lover of the circus and used some of these wagons in his park out in California. Well, anyway, he sells them to us in 1962. And the next year, Chappie now has a nice group of rollable wagons in good condition. And he thinks, well, what better way to promote a circus museum than to have a circus parade? And the first parade occurs here in Baraboo in 1963, but better yet, let's amp it up and make the parade a bigger parade and at a bigger venue. And in 1964, he puts on the first Milwaukee Circus Parade. And what better way to transport your circus wagons to Milwaukee than to get a fleet of railroad cars to transport it and recreate a circus train. And so in 1964, he starts to acquire old railroad equipment that was used both by circuses and by carnivals. A number of carnivals transported around the country by train as well. And he needs a place like the Ringlings to store and take care of them. And so it just so happens that the car shops are available. And in 1964, he acquires the car shops. And it becomes the center of our growing railroad collection. Here we have an image of the car shops just after it was acquired. And the other images we have it of where we did indeed refurbish and restore and maintain our growing fleet of railroad cars. And we get some images of the inside. I know that there was a hope that we could have taken you guys on a tour of the car shops in addition to the talk today. Unfortunately, due to a variety of liability issues and also some existing projects that we have going on down there, that just wasn't possible. But we do actually hope to have the building someday open to the public. But until that time, we have some images of its interior, and we have some here from the 1960s to give you a sense of what it was like. Big, long building, 3 railroad tracks. We have catwalks here to work on the upper levels of the railroad cars. Those could be somewhat treacherous. There is newspaper accounts of employees falling from those catwalks. And getting hurt back in the days of the Ringling. But we used this building to maintain our fleet of railroad cars up until 2003. That was when the last circus train left Baraboo to take the wagons to Milwaukee. After 2003, we had one more circus parade in 2009, but we used trucks. But so then after 2003, it really shifts to being a storage facility. In addition, though, to maintaining our rail fleet, this was also where our facilities department for the museum was housed. So just off of this building. And today you'll see actually a blue and white striped building accessible by rail. That's our wagon restoration shop was located there for over 20 years. There's a little white building right there. That was our painting shop for our wagons. And so we actually added a few buildings to this site. But after 2003, that's when our current wagon restoration department was built. And so after 2003, there's a shift. The facility becomes our storage for our railroad car collection and for our wagons that are awaiting restoration. And that is its current use today. Between what we have on the museum grounds and what we have here at the car shops, we have about 36 historic railroad cars. Pullman cars, box cars, flat cars that were used both by carnivals and circuses. We very much intend to keep them, and we very much intend hopefully to incorporate them in exhibits down the road in the future. So that's where things stand today. This gives you a little bit of a flavor of the shops today. That's pretty much the end of my presentation. I'm very happy to open it up to questions. And with that, I'll say thank you very much. Is there any questions? I should have had that. Yes, I do. I don't have a let me get the moment. We do have the question was, do we have the dimensions for the building? And we do indeed have that. They're actually very accurate. In 2015, we initiated a refurbishment of the building. We stabilized the exterior, we added sprinklers and a new security system, and the blueprint plans give exact dimensions of it. It is, I believe, and all of you can correct me on this, it is, I believe, the longest wooden railway structure in Wisconsin and one of the longest wooden railway structures in the United States, I believe. I don't want to say that with certainty, but I know it's certainly right out there. But I apologize. I don't have the exact dimensions in my head at the moment, but we do have that on file. It's long. I guarantee you that. Any other questions?
In Florida, how does that circus connect to this or anything?
In Florida, how the circus, like the Ringling Brothers Circus, the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus as it exists now in Florida is a separate business entity.
From this?
Oh, from this. So we've always been independent of them. And in fact, there was some confusion in 2017 when the Ringling show went off the road that were we closing? No, we've always been independent of them. We have a very good relationship with them. And they're very supportive of us. But we are two separate entities. And today, the Ringlings are back on the road today. They don't use trains anymore. They use trucks and such like that. But they are on the road today and are having a successful season back. So
I noted a couple of the circus train cars from the big show are spotted outside a building. Is that your car shops there?
We have actually 3 cars from the last Ringling train. So the gentleman was talking about several railroad cars that we have on the museum property. Are they from the Florida show? And they are. When the Feld family, who owned the Ringling Brothers title, in fact, they've owned the Ringling title longer than the Ringlings owned it. But the Feld Entertainment, when they retired the Ringling show in 16 or 17, they donated 3 of their railroad cars to us, 2 of which you can see on the museum grounds. There is the stock car, which is down by the big top tent. And that housed, we believe, both elephants and horses, depending upon the time and the unit that it was in.
That was a longer orange car?
No, the longer orange car. So all the cars we got from them are silver colored.
Okay.
There's several cars on the main museum grounds. So of the ones that we got from Feld, the stock car that's down by the big top tent, that's one. And then right across from our restaurant or our hippodrome, there are 2 silver cars. One is an advertisement car that dates to World War II. That's been on the museum grounds since we opened. Next to it is a long silver car. That's the clown car. So the clowns, all the clown units, they lived in that car. That was where they traveled and where they lived. We hope to actually have that open too, but like all good coach cars, it's narrow hallways and having it ADA accessible is not possible. But until we figure out that, it is, but it's all there and it's all original. And then there is a flat car that is down at the car shops. And that is a purpose-built flat car that had 4 modern circus wagons on there. We have those 4 wagons. But the way the wagons were loaded, the way they were hitched and secured to the flat car, that was all purpose-built by the Ringling show. So we have that. So we have examples of a coach car, a stock car, and a flat car in our collection. The orange car, I think if that's the one that's like a red, orangish wooden coach car, That's outside the wagon pavilion back behind my building. That is actually a 1924 coach car. That was an advertisement car used by the John Robinson Circus and also the Algae Barn Circus. We do hope someday to have that restored. It's a very rare car. We have inside our main pavilion a horse car, a stock car from the 30s, and we have several flat cars. So there's a flat car that's loaded with wagons inside our wagon pavilion. And then there are two orange flat cars right next to our restaurant as well. And I forget what show they were from, but they were made by the Mount Vernon Company or the Warren Tank Company. Warren Tank Company and Mount Vernon were the two main producers of show equipment or rail stock equipment for both carnivals and circuses. And so the fact that they're made by those companies are really extra special to us. We've used those two flat cars for, depending on the season, for loading demonstrations where we'll load up wagons and unload them. But they have some special facets to them as well. There's the snubbing posts where the rope would be hitched around to work with the horses to ease those wagons up and off to kind of take the tension and to control the weight of the movement of those wagons. So there's kind of neat facets to those flat cars as well. And that's one of the cool things about our collection. We have railroad cars in the car shops, for example. I know I'm going off on a direction. I'll take another question in a second. We have coach cars that were used by circus managers. There's one coach car that I've not seen the inside of yet, but it's the Rudy Bundy car. Rudy Bundy was a major manager for the Ringling show in the late 60s, early 70s. And we have interior shots of it where it is right out of the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, plush carpeting. I think there's like walled carpeting. There's an reel-to-reel audio sound system built into the wall. There's a bar. I mean, it's right out of your classic basement den from that era. And I don't know if that still is there. I haven't had a chance to get down there to look into it yet, but I'd love to have that car restored back to its prime and have that on display. And so we have a very diverse collection of stuff. Like with our wagons, we have a very diverse collection of wagons that represent different facets of the circus operation. So we hope to really showcase those pieces at some point in the future. And one of the nice things is, even though one of the things that is a misunderstanding about museums is that you cannot always, and really should not always, display everything. To display stuff also puts them at risk because they're exposed to light and to environment. If you can have them within a controlled environment that preserves them. Half of our mission is to preserve, so that in 50 years, 75 years, 100 years, all of these items are still with us. And that's why stuff is in storage, and that's why we rotate stuff around. So even though we have these railroad cars and they're not on display now, having them in a secure facility that, it's not getting rained on. I mean, we have cars outside and we got to try to deal with that as well. But by taking care of these cars to the best of our ability, they're going to be around so that in 10 years or 20 years, maybe we'll have a facility where we can have more on display. And so that is one of our long-term goals. Are there any other questions?
You ever figure out how many clowns you can fit in the clown car?
Actually, we have an answer to that too. I want to say, what is it? Is there 10 staterooms in there and 2 people per stateroom? But it's tight. I mean, we're talking about a room that is like 5 feet wide and, not even 10 feet long. So there's a double bunk and, basically a floor space that's maybe about 2 or 3 feet wide, and then a counter, a place for a coffee pot. College dorm rooms today. My college dorm room was a tiny little cubicle, and this was a quarter of that, but I tell you, we did a couple of oral histories of Ringling employees back in the summer of 16, and everybody talks about life on the train, and it was something that they all, whether you're a clown or whatever, any type of performer working crew, that was, for those who worked on that show in those decades, living on the train was part of the real special experience of working for the Ringlings. And so though it was cramped, it was something that I think they all would go back to today in a heartbeat if they could. Thank you all very much.